Hi, I'm Nick, publisher of Flame Tree. Welcome to the 2021 live and spooky Creepy Carnival. 6 days of awesome Halloween rides with sessions on everything from creature creation to short story writing, H.P. Lovecraft and Bram Stoker.
Hey, I'm Sarah, the Flame Tree publicist. Each day at this time, with an extra show on Saturday, you can join us for a ride for panels on female leads and final girl tropes, horror in space, and drawing inspiration from real life stories.
Hi, it's Maria here. I run the marketing at Flame Tree, and we just can't wait for you guys to see some of our favorite authors, from Ramsey Campbell to Vic Castro, Jonathan Jens to J.H. Moncrief, Nadia Fifi and Glenn Rolfe, and so many others.
Hi, my name's Don Doria, executive editor of Flame Tree Press. We're kicking off this week of horror celebration with the first session on short stories and inspirational authors, hosted by John Everson, featuring Gwendolyn Kiste, Lucy A. Snyder, Dan Coxon, and Maria Haskins.
All right, well, welcome to the first day of Flame Tree Press's Live and Spooky. This is the Hellish, Helter, Skelter session where we're going to talk about short fiction, short scary stories. And I will be your moderator. My name is John Everson. I'm going to quickly run through and give you the official bios of our panelists today, but then I'm going to actually ask them to talk a little bit about their own work, because they can do that far better than I can or this pre-printed bio would. First off, we have Maria Haskins. Maria is a Swedish-Canadian writer and reviewer of speculative fiction. Her work has appeared in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Fireside, Black Static, Strange Horizons, and elsewhere. And her short story collection, Six Dreams About the Train, is out now from Trepidatio Publishing. Lucy Snyder is also with us. Lucy is the Shirley Jackson Award nominated and 5-time Bram Stoker Award winning author of 15 books and over 100 published short stories. Her most recent books are the short story collection Halloween Season, the poetry collection Exposed Nerves, and the forthcoming novel Sister Maiden Monster. Gwendolyn Kiste is a Bram Stoker Award winning author of The Rust Maidens, Bones Set in Feathers, and Her Smile Will Untether the Universe, Pretty Marys All in a Row, and The Invention of Ghosts. Her work has been translated into multiple languages, and her third novel, Reluctant Immortals, is due out next year from Saga Press. Dan Coxon is also here. Dan is an award-winning editor and writer from London, and a finalist for both the Shirley Jackson Awards and British Fantasy Awards. His debut collection, Only the Broken Remain, is available from Black Shuck Books, while his co-edited nonfiction anthology, Writing the Uncanny, is now out from Dead Ink Books. And then there's me, John Everson, a Bram Stoker Award-winning author of a dozen novels, including Voodoo Heart, The Devil's Equinox, and Covenant. He, or me, I, have published dozens of short stories, and 2 of my characters appear in the recent Netflix series V-Wars. I am always enthusiastic to discuss the culinary joys of the jalapeno, just ask, as well as European giallo cinema. Praised by Booklist, Cemetery Dance, and Hell Notes, Kirkus Reviews called my work hard to put down. I think that's because we put glue on all of the back pages, but nevertheless, let's get to it. Enough with those. Let's actually go through the panelists. I'd like to hear, we're here to talk about short fiction. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what draws you to the short form, what you've worked on, why are you here? Gwendolyn, I'm going to start with you because you're the first on my screen.
Fair enough, fair enough. I have always loved short fiction, and that was my first introduction to horror, was through short stories, through Poe, through Ray Bradbury. So it's something that, the short fiction form has always been my favorite, really. And so I've had one short fiction collection come out, And Her Smile Will Untether the Universe, and then I've written a lot of short fiction. I have over 100 short stories published, I believe, and Yeah, so it's just I think it's a great form for horror. I know we're going to get into that as we go along, but I think it's the perfect vehicle for horror. So I'm a huge fan.
Awesome. Lucy, how about you?
I've been writing short fiction for quite a while now. I did enjoy it as a reader when I was first starting out. Initially, I thought, okay, I want to write novels. And then I got into Clarion. And as a result of being in that workshop, like it really drove home, like how interesting and challenging short stories are to write. And I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to spend a while writing short fiction because that's really going to help me kind of level up my writing game. In ways that I probably wouldn't otherwise. And that was the case, but I also got really into writing short fiction so much that it took me a while to get back to writing novels, like kind of a long while, in fact. At this point, half my books are short story collections, and I also co-edited the Chiral Mad 4 anthology with Michael Bailey. So I've done a little bit on the editorial side as well. And I just have a lot of fun writing short fiction.
Perfect. Dan.
Yeah, so my background's kind of within the editorial side as well. So I've had 2 anthologies of horror fiction out and a 3rd anthology that wasn't. I probably started writing short stories mainly because my attention span was very short. It was when I was about 14 or 15, and the idea of writing a novel just seemed infeasible. So I wrote short stories, and they were mostly terrible because I didn't really read short stories at the time, and so I didn't really understand the form properly at the time. But that, I think, was why I started on them. But as it turns out, I mean, again, like Gwendolyn said, we'll get to this later, but I think it's a wonderful form for horror fiction in particular, and for certain types of horror fiction in particular. And I mean, I don't have a novel out, so for me, that pretty much has been my entire experience today has been short fiction. That may change in the future. I spent today working on a novel draft, so you never know. But for now, that's where we're at.
Maria, how about you?
Yeah, I'm very similar to, I think, everybody else here. I debuted as a writer in Sweden so long ago that it's ancient history pretty much. Moved to Canada later in life, and when I started writing after being away from writing for about 10 years, it was short fiction. Like I just felt like that was a way to see if I could do it. First of all, if I could write in English, if I had something in me that I could bring out. And I started reading a lot of short fiction in all the zines I could find online, everywhere I could find it. And there was such a wealth and such a breadth of stuff out there. I just felt like this was something where you could go in and you could play around with form, you could play around with everything, with language, with form. And I just found it so interesting. And I mean, here I am, I love writing it because of that, that it's so flexible, what you can do with the form in short fiction. And I love reading it. So, I mean, I write and review short fiction, speculative fiction of all kinds, but especially short fiction. And I just love it. There's so much good stuff out there.
There is. The short form drew me early on because when I started writing, I mean, I was a newspaper reporter myself, and so everything I did was fairly short, right? That was my job, and I never really thought I would make a big go at being a fiction writer, but I did like to write short stories now and then. And the cool thing about a short story was you could get in and out in an afternoon. I mean, I'd sit down on Sunday afternoon, write a short story. It was done. That was great. It was very fulfilling. You're in and you're out and it's all over. But so the first 2 books that I published were short fiction collections. And then I started on the novel train. And I've done 2 more short fiction collections since then, but I don't write as many short stories anymore. And what I've actually found, which I'd be interested to talk about a little later, is it's hard for me to get back into writing short fiction because I think it is a very specific way of writing. And when I started out, I used to write stories that were a couple thousand words. Now I cannot sit down and write a short story that's less than 6,000 or 8,000 words. It's like, it's different. Your mind goes differently when you're writing in the long form. But one of the first things I wanted to talk about, and a couple of you have already alluded to, was horror and how it is served by the short form. Edgar Allan Poe is one of the most well-known authors of horror, right? And basically everything he did was short stories. In fact, I have show and tell. One of the very first books that I ever bought was at a garage sale when I was about 14 years old, or maybe 12. And it was The Tales of Edgar Allan Poe. And I read that book over and over and over again as a little kid. But Poe is a master and obviously worked in the short form. And I've heard people say that, you know, the short form is what serves horror best. Does anyone have thoughts about that? Like, do you agree, disagree?
I agree. I mean, I've written several horror novels and I obviously love them. And I do think that they certainly, you know, having a longer form for horror is great. But I think because I first read Poe, and so that was sort of my entrance into the horror genre, that I'm always just I love the short fiction form, like the short form for horror. So I'm always like, yes, it's the best, because it's like, I think it's also much harder to kind of maintain those kind of emotions over the course of a longer narrative. I think a short story, you can really get in, get out. You can really leave somebody with that kind of feeling of dread and fear in a way that it can be harder to maintain and to sustain over the course of a longer narrative.
Yeah, I would say that there's a particular type of horror story which I love, which is sometimes referred to as the uncanny, sometimes as weird fiction. It encompasses things like ghost stories and the supernatural. And that type of story in particular, I think it's true what Gwendolyn's just said, that it's very hard to sustain that kind of unsettling tone over a longer piece. So there are certain types of horror which I think are suited to novels, but that I think is very difficult to do, to write a 70, 80,000 word book that sustains that kind of unsettling unease all the way through it. Whereas a short story, as you say, it can leave lots of gaps, and it's those gaps which quite often create that sense of unease and create that uncertainty, and ultimately create the horror, I think. And that's what I like. I like those stories that leave questions unanswered, that leave that nagging doubt at the back of your head and have you kind of wondering, watching the shadows in the corner of the room. That's the stuff which I really enjoy.
I agree with what Dan and Gwendolyn said. There are certain storytelling aspects of short fiction that really do lend themselves to spooking out the reader quite a lot. You can still do that in long form, but you've got a lot more work for yourself. In a short story, with regard to the world building, it's like you can just kind of hint at things, you know, with regard to how does all this work. And, you know, the reader can fill in the gaps and let their imagination run away with it. But once you're novel length, like, you have to start really explaining some of this stuff, and you have a lot more opportunities for the reader's suspension of disbelief to come crashing right down, because they'll read your in detail explanation of this and they'll be like, what? No, that wouldn't work. I can't believe in this anymore. So yeah, from world building and pacing standpoints, long form is a lot more difficult. Like Dan said, I think there are some forms that are great in novel, like for instance, your slow burn Gothic horror novel, like that really works out well. But particularly if you're doing something like, you know, a splatter story, a bizarro story, like that works best in short, sharp chunks, you know.
Yeah, I would agree with what everybody's saying here. And I think we're probably all sort of saying the same thing. We like that when things are unexplained in horror, like that works a lot better for me, I know personally. And in short stories, you can leave so much out, like everybody else said too. Like, and I find when I read horror novels sometimes, and it comes to the explanation phase of what's going on, that kind of takes away the horror of it. Like, it becomes less scary the more you explain it. And of course, in a novel, you have to some extent explain what's going on. And I just find for short fiction, it's almost like the jump scare, right? In the movie, it's like taking the jump scare from a movie and basically writing a short story that, and also because like the jump scare factor, but also that in a short story, you can build the mood very in like a really concentrated fashion. So you're just doing this and then you jump out of it. That's the end. And you leave that feeling of the atmosphere you built up. And I just feel it's so effective. Like when I grew up, I read Poe, but I also read Bradbury a lot, and he's got that those really uncanny, strange stories, that sort of science fiction horror, and he just has that perfect ear for when to jump out of it, when to jump into it, when to jump out of it. And I just love that in short fiction, horror short fiction, that it's so you get this little gem. You don't have to explain the whole world, but you get this gem that is really effective in horror.
I was going to bring up the jump scare aspect myself, because I think, you know, you want to build towards an end that explodes an awful lot of the times. Not always. Sometimes it's very quiet, but you know, you're really, in a short story, you're building towards an end once. Whereas in long form, you're going up, down. It's very episodic. You have multiple jump points, right? So I think with a short story, it allows you to really focus on a single idea or a single emotion. I think that's, for me, one of the biggest differences between novel writing and a short story. Is most of my short fiction is really pushed at an emotion. Like, I want to evoke a specific feeling in the reader by the end of it. Well, you know, novel, you can be all over the place, right? So you've got lots of stuff that you're doing there. But one of the things you mentioned, Bradbury and Poe, I wanted to ask everyone, because this is Halloween time, right? People are watching this, getting ready for the season. We're the very first of the spooky series this week. Who would you recommend people read in terms of best short fiction authors? What are some of your favorites?
I can go first. I review short fiction on a monthly basis or more, and it's I've got, like, it's like I could unroll the list and we'd be here for the rest of the day. There's a lot. There are a lot of really amazing writers out there in the horror short fiction field. I mean, I'll say some of my favorites would include, Stephen Graham Jones, who does amazing both with horror novels, horror short fiction. Cassandra Khaw, amazing too. Everybody who's here, because like you guys, I read your stuff too. And I also, one of the newer writers that I've lately been seeing several really great short stories from, that I would recommend everybody to check out, is Susan Palumbo, who's had a couple of short stories in the dark, which are just grab you by the throat, suspense and horror. They are awesome. So Susan Palumbo, check her out.
Others, do I have to point?
I'll go, unless you want to go, Gwendolyn.
No, you can go.
Okay, as Maria said, there are a whole bunch of people out there writing really top drawer short fiction right now. And I can name a few people, but I'm going to be leaving people off the list and thinking about this 3 hours from now going, damn it, why didn't I say so-and-so? But like Victor Laval has written some really great short stories. Shannon McGuire, she's more known for writing fantasy, but she's written some really good horror shorts. Richard Thomas has a short story collection coming out pretty soon. I read that. It's great. I encourage people to check that one out. A couple of years back, I read Emily Cataneo's debut short story collection, and I feel like not enough people read that because all her stories were really, really good. In terms of other folks, there's Elizabeth Massey. Gosh, I could name a whole bunch of people. Marge Simon, Chesha Burke. The list will really go on and on.
I will echo that. Emily's collection, Speaking to Skull Kings, I believe it was called. It was a beautiful collection. Definitely did not get nearly as many readers as it deserved. It deserves all the readers. So yeah, that's a great collection. I'm also going to add Krista Carmen and Eden Royce. They both do some great short fiction as well. I love some of their collections. They're just fantastic writers as well. So, and obviously we already talked about Bradbury. If we're going back to the classics, I love Bradbury short fiction, and Shirley Jackson's short fiction is just fantastic. So The Lottery, but she had a lot of other short stories that are just great. That aren't as widely read as The Lottery. So
I was going to say, actually, I think Shirley Jackson is probably the exception to what I said earlier, in that she wrote a couple of fantastic novels here, which still sustain that uncanny, unsettling feeling all the way through from beginning to end. But I think it's because she was such a great master of the short story. I think it's a technique she mastered in the short story, and then wrote 2 very short novels, which I think stand amongst all the greatest of this genre. But I wanted to mention some British writers, since I'm this side of the pond. Going back to the classics, Robert Aikman, I think, is absolutely superb. And I know he's being published more in the US now as well, which is wonderful. In terms of contemporary writers, I wanted to mention Ramsey Campbell, just because he's been around forever, and he very much feels like a godfather of the scene over here now. And interestingly, he used to know Robert Aikman, and used to go around to his house for dinner, and has some fascinating stories about Robert Aikman. And then some of the younger writers here at the moment as well, Laura Mauro, Priya Sharma. There's some really, really fantastic writers over here at the moment. Yeah, I'll check those out. They're both with Undertow publications in Canada.
Well, I'm gonna echo the UK element. I figured you guys would hit a lot of the newer writers, but I went to my shelf and pulled a couple of my absolute favorite short fiction collections off, and you've got to mention Michael Marshall Smith. His More Tomorrow and Other Stories was one of the best short fiction collections I ever read. Another one would be Gary Brombeck, who his short fiction, I remember, I actually was a proofreader for this book way back whenever the heck it came out. And I laid in bed at night with the manuscript, and that's when I used to edit. And I just lay there and scribble. And every single story in that collection, I would be like, oh, he did it to me again. So I really love that book. And, you know, you can't go wrong with one of the original masters. I still have Stephen King's Night Shift, which is a phenomenal collection of short stories before every single short story of his became novel length, you know, which are also good. But I mean, these were truly like short stories. If there was a short story that you wish you had written, what would it be? Does anyone have one of those? Like you heard this story and it stuck with you, and for years you just kept thinking about that story.
I think I'll go with The Lottery, both because it's an absolutely incredible story, and also because I think she weathered the storm of it so well. Like, she never got into this mindset that, like, you know, it got so much hate mail from the New Yorker when it was first published, and she never explained herself. She never kind of, like, as they say now, clapped back. Maybe she would have if she'd been on social media. Maybe if it was a different world. Maybe it's because she couldn't. I don't know. But, like, even in interviews, she would, like, kind of resist explaining it. So I always thought that that was, like, such a great reaction, because especially now being on social media, everybody always thinks they have to respond to absolutely everything. And Shirley Jackson was like, yeah, I got a bunch of hate mail, just gonna keep on going. And so it's not only that the story's so great, but I just love her reaction to other people's reactions. So I think there's at least a lot to learn there.
I'll throw out one because this story still sticks with me after, God, what, 20 years after I read it in Cemetery Dance. I don't know when it came out exactly. I should have looked that up. But Jack Ketchum's The Box. I don't know if anyone has ever read that one. Just a great building piece. Really strong story. Anyone else? Dan, Maria?
Yeah, I was going to say, going back to Robert Aikman, his story, The Hospice, I think is fantastic. The book I just edited, Writing the Uncanny, there's an entire essay on the hospice in there. And it's just renewed my love for it. Just reading someone else exploring it and picking it apart, it just made me realize again what an incredibly constructed story it is. It's very difficult to say whether it actually is a horror story, but then that's true of a lot of Aikman's work. But it is just very unsettling and uneasy from start to finish. And there were just odd details thrown in throughout it that just wrong foot you at every turn. And you just kind of get to the end of it, just, I don't know, just feeling like it's got under your skin. I kind of like that.
For me, there's a couple of people. I got a hold of, I was in a workshop with Kelly Link before she was known as a writer. and she had submitted the specialist hat. And her draft of that was freaking amazing. I remember just sitting there going, oh my God, this is so good. I wish I could write something this good. And of course, she's gone on to, do some really, really great stuff. The second writer, and I will get a talking to later for not having mentioned him in the first round, but Gary Braunbeck. A lot of his short stories, because I did get to read those first, and I'd be like, dang it, how is he so good? And the one that really blew me away, there were a couple, but Hasseldama springs to mind, just reading that short story. And just, it starts out, in this blue collar environment, like many of his stories do. And then it just rises to such epic levels of, supreme horror by the end. And it's just the scope that it opens up into is just amazing. So, that was another one.
I would say for me, if it's a contemporary, it's Angela Slater for me. I read her stuff, and old or new, it's just, she has this language, like her prose, and like she's got this kind of brutality sometimes that comes through that is just, I just love it. When she does things like in family settings, especially in her stories where mothers do not behave like mothers are supposed to behave. And like, I love those. But I would say for me, the one short story, which is a classic, I'm going back to Bradbury again. When I grew up, my dad was a huge Bradbury fan. He still is. So I read, that was probably the first short fiction I ever read was Bradbury. And I still remember, because it was probably the first time that somebody talked to me about a short story as being, I love it. And it was my dad. I remember him giving me this one of Bradbury's short story collection. He said, you have to read this story. It's in here. And it was The One Who Waits by Bradbury, which is sort of a sci-fi horror set on Mars, obviously, since we're talking Bradbury. And that story is, I can go back and read it now. I mean, I probably read it first when I was like 13. And the atmospheric sense of both like this sadness and this horror mixed together in that story, and it's told from what we would consider the monsters or the bad side, and just watching this Martian expedition land, and it doesn't even know what it is, this thing that's on Mars, and ends up wreaking havoc on the expedition. And I love that story still. I can still go back to that one, and I can sort of see how, both as a reader and a writer, that story has influenced me throughout my life. Probably it set some kind of pattern in my head as I was reading it. So I still love that one.
I'm sure I must have read that at some point.
Yeah, it's in a few of his short story collections, like with a lot of Bradbury stuff. It just pops up sort of here and there. But yeah, it's like it's got the prose, and it's got the feel of just that strange dread.
You just reminded me of someone that nobody has mentioned yet, I think, and we should. Richard Matheson, one of the key creepy horror, a little bit of sci-fi authors. I remember reading his Born of Man and Woman, which is sort of this alien creature locked in a tower, gonna destroy the world kind of story. And the way that story builds is just, I reread that over and over again when I was in high school. I love that story.
It's so funny when you just said there's somebody we haven't mentioned. I thought, oh, we haven't mentioned Richard Matheson yet. And then you said that. I'm like, that's perfect. That's so perfect. Because I was actually thinking before this today, I'm like, we got to mention Richard Matheson, because we were talking about like playing with format, and he had some really interesting stories. Like, he was the first writer I'd ever seen that actually used footnotes in a fiction story, because it was like, something that it was like almost like an academic article. So there were footnotes, or there's stories where he'll use like a definition of something right in the middle and give you like a dictionary definition of like a term that's like made up for the story. And just like, I love that. Like, and some of his stuff is so weird. It's not necessarily horror. He has a story, I wish I remember the name of it, that like California becomes like sentient and starts taking people over. I wish I remembered the name of this story, but it's so bizarre, and like it starts spreading and everybody starts like being like wanting to go to the beach, and like it's so like it's not necessarily horror, but it's so weird and it's unsettling because it's this thing that isn't really necessarily bad, but that's taking over. And like I love some of his work like that. So yay for Richard Matheson.
And again, I think, like we were saying earlier, all those things you just mentioned, they're all things you could do in short stories that I think most people would struggle to endure a novel.
Yeah, try writing a whole
sentient
novel.
being.
Try writing a whole novel in second person. That would be painful to read.
Yeah, I know some people have done it, but yeah, and I love second person. I write in second person a lot in my short fiction, but I'm always like, I don't know. I mean, the only way I think I'd ever try it in a novel is if it's from several different perspectives and only one of the perspectives is second person. It might work then because then you're almost using it more like a short fiction kind of style. Because yeah, I think a lot of things like that, or even the footnotes, like I said in the Richard Matheson story, it's great. But if you had a whole fiction novel like that, it might work. I'm sure there's a writer out there who could make it work, but I don't think I would be brave enough to be that writer to try to make footnotes work in a novel. So yeah.
Flame Tree has a short fiction collection coming out next week, I believe, which Dan and I are both in. I don't think anyone else is in. It's called Beyond the Veil. And so I would encourage, of course, everyone to check that out. But it made me think, like, when I was growing up, it seemed like all the majors were putting out these anthologies, and there were a couple editors who just did a million of them too. And a lot of them were unthemed, which, you know, stories could be about anything. You didn't know what you were going to get. But then you'd get, you know, the vampire anthology or, you know, whatever. What do you guys prefer in terms of a collection of short stories? Do you like a theme? Do you not like a theme?
I could talk about this for hours. So working as an anthology editor, I mean, this is a big thing in the industry at the moment. We have, so with the unthemed ones, like this one that's coming out, Beyond the Veil, I think they rest very much on the name of the editor, for starters. So Mark Morris is known within the field. He's very popular. He's a best-selling author in his own right, and so he can sell that. And then the list of authors that you have tied to it. With a themed anthology, you can get away with a lot more. So if you're younger and starting out in your career, I think it's much better. A themed anthology, people know what they're getting with it. You know, if you like vampires, you're going to like the vampire anthology. If you don't, you don't. With these, you get a very mixed bag, and you're basically trusting that editor to have good taste and to pull you through sort of by their taste alone through this book. And so I think there's that. I think there's a real element of trust. There's a handful of people who can just do it on their name alone, of which Mark is one of them. I think most other people, you struggle to sell unthemed on the whole.
Yeah, I would. That makes a lot of sense, because I was going to say, you know, I think it depends. There are definitely times when they're unthemed that, you know, I'm super excited, but I'm a lot of times more excited if it is a theme, just as a reader, because then, like you said, you kind of know what you're getting, you know what's going, at least within some kind of general idea of, is it going to be vampires? Is it going to be ghosts? Is it going to be, you know, there's a Shirley Jackson anthology that just came out. So I think that, yeah, I think it really is. That's such a great way of talking about it.
So I did the copy edit on the Shirley Jackson anthology, and that's excellent. I highly recommend that.
Yeah,
like anthologies. I think harking back, I mean, the one that everyone always refers back to here, I don't know how well it was in the States, was the handbooks of horror, which were kind of the 1970s, 1980s. And I mean, I have a collection of them in the other room, unfortunately, otherwise I would show them to you. But they're always referred to here as the almost kind of the pinnacle of the unthemed anthology. And again, that was because you knew you were getting a certain standard, you knew you were getting a certain quality. You quite often had the same writers popping up, you know, maybe not in each one, but maybe sort of every other book you'd have. Quite often a Robert Aikman story would appear in them. So you kind of knew what you were getting. And I think that's the issue with unthemed anthologies, is you've got to convince readers that they know what they're getting. They either know the authors, or they know the editor, or there's something else about it that pulls them in, because without a theme, I think that's difficult.
It's interesting, because I've always been on the side of the unthemed, because I want to be completely surprised story by story. But not to say that themes don't work, because they can, but I think if the theme the theme needs to be broad enough. Like I used to love the Hot Blood series. Okay, well, we know that every story is going to have sex in it, but it could be a vampire or a werewolf or a serial killer. It could be anything that is the bad guy in that kind of anthology. But if you're reading a vampire anthology, well, every single story that you're going to have a vampire, right? And maybe that's good as a reader because that's what you want, but it does sort of take the surprise out of it. And I think you guys would probably agree, I think, is that it's a little harder to write for when you say, okay, I'm doing a vampire anthology, write me a vampire story. Well, okay, well now you've really got to try to come up with something that's going to stand out from the pack because every story in there is going to be a vampire story.
I actually find it easier when I have themes. Like, if somebody says, hey, get me a vampire story, 4,000 to 5,000 words, it's like, okay, you've just given me a prompt, and I can start thinking about how to make what I'm going to write fit in with that, and then try to approach it from the weirdest angle possible, because I'm me. But sometimes if there's just write what you want, then I'm like, okay, what do I want? So sometimes the themes are very helpful. Going back to your earlier question about what readers want, we also have to consider that what we as panelists want as readers might be very different than what a lot of other people out there might want as readers. The thing that I'm thinking about is I wrote a story for Shadowed Souls, which was an urban fantasy, slight horror anthology that was co-edited by Jim Butcher. Now, most everybody, he is such a name that like his name became the theme in a lot of readers' heads. We were given the rough theme of, write urban fantasy adventure, which is, general enough. But a lot of people picked up that book and then got mad that it wasn't all Jim Butcher stories. Like they completely glazed past everything else that was on the cover and they just saw Jim Butcher and they were like, yeah. And then they were like, who's the Snyder chick? I don't care about her stuff. Bah! Like easily half the 1-star reviews the book got on Amazon were from people who were specifically mad that it wasn't all Jim Butcher stories. So it was like, womp womp, oh well.
I was thinking about this actually, that I love both. Like, honestly, I'm a voracious reader of short fiction. But one thing I was thinking about too is that I'm seeing a lot more publications like zines that actually have themes. Like there's the brand new one, The Deadlands, which stories that deal with death. There's, for the fantasy crowd, there's Mermaids Monthly, which obviously a lot of mermaid stories, all mermaid stories. So I'm seeing a lot of this, even in like the magazine part, where it's like, it's sort of an overall theme. And I see some great fiction there. Like, I think if I was writing, I'm more like Lucy. Then I'm like, if you tell me what you want, and then I'll put a twist on it somehow, but you tell me sort of the general thing that you want, and I'll that's almost like a writing prompt that's easier to work from.
I've had it go both ways for me. Sometimes the prompt works and I come up with a really great story, and other times I'm just like, can't get there, or I'm just not that happy with the result because I felt like I was boxed into something. And of course, as a writer, you're supposed to not, get out of the box, right? So, but that's also the challenge, I suppose, of a themed anthology, is how do you approach it from left field? It's a trick. So let's talk a little bit about your approach as a writer to the short form. Do you guys all outline things? Do you just start with a vague idea and write and it happens? And how do you invest the reader in whatever the horror is? How do you, because we were talking earlier about the unwritten thing is often the scariest part of a short piece. So how do you establish it and not say what it is? Lucy, I'm going to go with you first. How about that?
Generally, I don't physically, plot out or outline a short story unless the editor has demanded that ahead of time, and I find that process, really tedious. Short stories, generally, I can keep the whole thing in my head before I sit down to write, and so I'll spend a few days, maybe like 3 days to a week, just kind of thinking about the story, letting it kind of percolate a little bit, and thinking about the themes I want to work with. Who are my characters? You know, what's the setting? What does the character want? What are the threats to the characters possibly? And I have at least a beginning and an ending in mind, and then I sit down to write. And sometimes mid-story, I think of something much better than what I initially thought of, and I'll just roll with that. But if I don't have an ending in mind, that makes it really hard to start writing, even if it's not the ending that I finish with. So that's just kind of how I work.
Maria?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I have a story. I think my prime example for how I write, and I'm sorry if there are birds screaming behind me, if anybody can hear them. We've got a house full of birds. But anyway, the story I'm thinking about is the one that is actually ended up, it was first in Black Static. It's now in Ellen Datlow's Best Horror of the Year. That's coming out later this year. And it's called Cleaver, Meat, and Block, which is set in a post-zombie apocalypse world. And this story was sort of distilled how I like to work when it's almost the easiest, which is when I have, like Lucy says, it's sort of a beginning and an end. And I have a strong, not so much an outline, but I have a strong sense of how I want the story to feel throughout. So for this story, I had a really strong, I knew that it had to be very quiet, like the prose had to be very quiet, but that it would tighten. The whole story would sort of tighten like a vice as you went through it, that you could feel this tension and that it was just like ratcheting it up, like that as you follow this one girl who survived the zombie apocalypse and now has to deal with a world where she has to share the world with the cured zombies. And that was, I think for me, that is the structure for the work that works the best. Not necessarily an outline, but like just a feeling of like, how do I tell this? Is it like going to be a big adventurous thing? Or is it going to be like, for this one, it was very much the tightening vice, which I think often works pretty good for horror.
Gwendolyn, how about you?
I usually start with an image or just like a core idea. I often find that if it's like a really specific image that I want to know more about, then I can go from there. I had a ghost story where it was just like this ghost that crawled across the floor. And so I was like, okay, now what's going on with this ghost? Another time I came up with an idea for a bathtub filled with blood. And I'm like, okay, what's that? You know, what's going on here? And kind of going from there. And I do often feel better, like Maria and Lucy were saying, that if I do know where the story's headed to some extent, even if like Lucy was saying, even if it doesn't end up going there, but if I feel like I'm writing towards something, although sometimes I'll just give it a go. If I'm like, let's see what happens. Usually I'm real frustrated at that point, but I have finished stories that I have no idea where they're going. It just usually takes longer to get there, but that's usually my approach. It's usually some kind of core idea or a very specific image and sort of building out from there. It's always really nice when the story starts with the first sentence. Every once in a while that happens and I know the first sentence right away and I'm like, yes, because otherwise I always feel like that's harder to kind of back build to it. It's always nice like if you have that right away, like, all right, I'm here right at the beginning and go from there. So
Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of done a bit of all of those things, to be honest. And whenever I've answered this question in the past, I've usually said that I kind of, it depends a bit on the story, and some stories I've planned out more and some less. I think to some extent that's probably a lie, and it's probably all the same process. Some I just do the planning in my head, and some I need to get it down on paper. Sometimes it's just because I have other things going on in my life, and I'm just kind of like, I want to write this, but I can't do it this week, so I'm going to put this down so it's still there. I have found gradually that part of what I try and do is what I was talking about earlier with Aikman and the hospice, is that kind of slow accumulation of kind of unsettling details. And I've actually found not planning everything works better for those, because things pop into my head, things that occur to me during the day, things that I see can pop into the story as I go along. Whereas if I plan too heavily, it kind of excludes those, and there's not that allowance of things coming in from outside. So I think that's my preferred way now. But yeah, it's probably a bit of what everyone said, to be honest.
Yeah, I usually have the end in mind and work towards that. And it's filling in the details that's the fun of writing, right? Like, how did that happen? How do we get there? Let's go on a journey and find out. All right, we're coming up on time. And I I know I've had a great time talking with all of you, and I'm looking forward to sitting down for some Halloween reading this week. Does anyone else have any last thoughts about the short story? Or would you like to promote something of yours that's coming out? Let people know where they can read your next piece.
I was just going to tell everybody to write more short stories and read more short stories, because I just think that it's such a great form, and sometimes people act like it's not something that's marketable or whatever, and that's not true. Like, everybody loves short stories. I feel like horror fans in particular. So write more short fiction and read more short fiction. So
Well, I'll on that note though, I have talked to people who they're just like, I hate short stories because they're too short. Like, I just get into the character and then they're gone, and I want more.
Who are they? Let me know who they are.
I actually had a lady at a book fair come up to my table, and she was looking at my books, and she said, "Oh, what's this one?" I said, "Okay, that's a short story collection." And she just like said, "I don't like short stories," and like just threw it down on the table and walked off. And I'm like, "What did short stories do to you, ma'am?" This was clearly some short story related trauma there in that woman's background. But, oh well.
I would say as well, if people like short stories and they want to write short stories, make sure they support short story markets, especially the magazines. We've mentioned Black Static a lot. I know they've been struggling in the last couple of years. There's Weird Horror at the moment with Undertow Publications. They all need support. Subscriptions are best if you can, because otherwise we just lose the markets. There's so many magazines that have fallen by the wayside over the years that have been great magazines and great markets for writers. So yeah, if people love short stories, then keep buying short stories. Forget that novel nonsense. Don't read any novels. Just read short stories.
All right. Any other last words? I'm going to close it up otherwise, and tell everyone to go out and read. And I'll give a last plug for Beyond the Veil, because I think you should read that when that comes out this month. Thank you everybody for coming. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope everyone has a great Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Thank you. Happy Halloween.
Be spooky.
Happy Halloween.